This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined once again by Richard Nephew, a senior research scholar at Columbia University and a former director for Iran at the National Security Council. Richard joins us today for another special episode on Israel and Iran, where we discuss the recent U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities and the outlook for a lasting ceasefire. Stay with us as we speak with Richard Nephew. Richard, thanks so much for joining us again.
Oh, thanks very much for having me.
Richard, of course, you played significant non-proliferation roles in numerous administrations. You've worked especially on the Iran account. You've done energy, you've done sanctions, so there's no shortage of things to discuss. But let me start first with Donald Trump seemed to have done a head fake last week, or he maybe seemed to have been giving an extra 2 weeks for diplomacy. But you and I both said on the last podcast that we believed he was going in regardless, and that turned out to be the case. But talk a little bit about the strike. Were you surprised nonetheless after he did the 2-week feint, or did you think to yourself, he's definitely going to do this?
Well, so I mean, I was still reasonably convinced that we were going to go in, just because I thought that the nuclear requirements were such that we would have to, right? You know, it was pretty clear to me that the Israelis, they had a plan, but they didn't have a whole lot of confidence in that plan, and they had some anxiety about whether or not it would do the needful with regard to Fordo. So when you add that up to, you know, the president's very clear concerns about a nuclear Iran, it seemed to me reasonable that he would authorize the strikes, especially because, you know, we had the capabilities to do it. I think I was probably expecting a little bit more time, another couple of days maybe, because of the 2-week piece and the fact that there had been some diplomatic engagement between the Iranians and the Europeans. I suppose that if that time had lengthened, I would have been a little bit more skeptical that he was going. But it seems pretty clear in retrospect, and based on the TikTok that came out, is he gave a little bit of time, a little bit of space, and then became convinced that the opportunity was there and wanted to take it.
Richard, unlike so many people in Washington and even in the U.S. government, you've actually sat across the table from Iranians and know them in ways that other experts do not. Are you surprised that when they met with the Europeans or they were working with Steve Witkoff, that they didn't, as they were staring down the barrel of a gun, that they didn't seem to want to compromise, that they didn't flinch?
Well, I think with Witkoff, they thought they probably had more time than that. I think their reaction after the Israelis started the attack and the kind of delay that it took suggests to me that they thought that they had a diplomatic process that was ongoing. They had a meeting that was scheduled on Sunday. I think, frankly, like many of us, they probably thought the Israelis were not going to launch any kind of attack while the diplomatic process was underway. Again, if you had told me the Israelis were striking on the Monday after the Sunday meeting in Oman, I don't think I would have been surprised. I was a little surprised it was right beforehand. I think with the Europeans, I'm not surprised at how that conversation went at all. Once the Iranians were under attack, the idea that they would concede things away to people who weren't actually materially relevant to the strikes, struck me as kind of improbable.
Put it this way. I mean, I don't necessarily think that the Iranians were going to allow a diplomatic solution to move forward, just because I didn't think it was in the character of the regime. But here they are. They've been bombed for about a week or more by the Israelis. They're on the cusp of the United States trying to get in. Are you surprised that they didn't agree to one of these ideas of, for example, moving the uranium outside the country to make it into fuel rods? Or was it within their own, or did you just say, you know what, they're going down with the ship here, they're going to let Fort Al get bombed?
Well, look, I think this goes to our fundamental question about what the Iranian interest is here. Do they want to have Natanz and Fort Al because they wanted to have a civil nuclear enrichment program? was at the core of this, or did they want to have a clandestine weapons program that eventually would be not clandestine? You don't get that if you're prepared to export your 60%, highly enriched uranium, right? And you certainly don't get that if it's as part of a, under the barrel of a gun when you've already lost Natanz and Fordo is hanging by a thread. You don't get that back. So I think the idea that they were going to make that kind of concession in the middle of strikes when frankly, the Israelis would probably say, great, you should export that and we're going to continue with the strikes anyway. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I could imagine before the attacks began, the Iranians agreeing to a deal where they would either dilute or export, some of their, HEU, if not all of it. But that would be part of a bigger package, right? That would include sanctions relief. That would include some sort of terms for what the enrichment program would look like. Because I don't think the Iranians were prepared to give up enrichment then. Candidly, I don't think they're prepared to give it up now. I think that if we ever actually figure out what the ceasefire looks like on the nuclear terms, we're going to find the Iranians have not changed their position, at least on the theoretical right to enrich uranium, even if practically it's a lot harder.
So I've seen a bunch of tweet threads from non-proliferation experts talking about the limitations of the strike. And some have mentioned, of course, that we don't know where the 200 or maybe it's 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium is. We know that Mark Wayne Mullen, the senator from Oklahoma, said it was buried. We're not sure how to verify that just now. Maybe the intelligence community does know that. But talk a little bit about the efficacy of the strikes. How big of a deal is it if there are several hundred centrifuges hidden away somewhere that even the Israelis didn't know about? How big of a deal is it if the Iranians were able to spirit away the HEU we just talked about?
Yeah. So look, I think there's two dimensions to this. The program, as it was, the big program that we knew about that was recounted in IAEA reports has been badly damaged. Natanz is basically gone as a current enrichment site. The underground halls, I think we can reasonably believe to now be destroyed. I think it's reasonable to believe that Iran's ability to produce the gas for those centrifuges at the uranium conversion site at Isfahan, that's been destroyed. Other uranium-related works at Isfahan also been destroyed. So I think it is reasonable to say that the program has been badly damaged as a result of this, probably set back multiple years, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said, in terms of the big program. The problem that we have is there is the big program, and then there is the what you can make weapons out of. And frankly, you don't need that much based on what the Iranians already had. If they still have access to the 400 odd kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, that is still enough for about 9 to 10 nuclear weapons. And if it's buried at Fordo, if it's buried in tunnels at Isfahan, if it's buried in tunnels at Natanz, the Iranians can dig it out. It's possible that the gas cylinders, so all this uranium is contained in these cylinders that kind of look like hot water heaters, basically. It's possible those were damaged. It's also possible they're just buried in dirt and that the Iranians can dig them out. So that is a huge amount of feedstock for a weapons program. We know that the Iranians stopped declaring their centrifuge production after attacks were made against the centrifuge production sites in 2021. And based on the math of how many centrifuge parts they probably were able to make, they probably have a clandestine stock of a couple thousand centrifuges. Whether or not those are in crates hidden somewhere or whether or not they've been stood up and are capable of enriching, again, that's something we don't know, especially if they are now at undeclared sites. And the big thing I'll just say to add on top of all this is, of course, we had a lot of uncertainties about the weaponization program. We didn't know a lot about what they were able to do with that material once they got it. It could be they were very far away. It could be that they were much closer than we knew. This is a massive gray area for all of us as we look at this. So I think the safest thing to say is, from a long-term perspective, program badly damaged. From a weapons breakout perspective, we don't know. They could still be very close. And I think that's one of the reasons why we need to get a much stronger picture as to what exactly is going on.
Richard, when people say maybe the Iranians will be able to detonate a quote-unquote crude nuclear device, what does that mean? Does that mean it's only the fissile material, or do you have to have some measure of so-called weaponization around it to make it explode?
Well, so take our history on this, right? We were a nuclear armed power when we tested at Trinity. I think that's a fair argument. Now that device was mounted to a gantry. It wasn't, droppable itself, but a couple of weeks later, we were in a position to drop our first atomic bombs, and that was the nuclear weapons age, right? The Iranians don't have the same kind of bomber fleet that we have, so I don't think anyone's imagining that that's what they're going to replicate. But if the Iranians were to go down the path of the U.S. with Trinity, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, they could produce large, not missile. We're not talking about missile weapons, but large devices that could be useful as nuclear weapons. If they wanted to, they could be mounted on a ship, they could be put on a truck, and certainly they could drive it out to the desert and test it. I think where sometimes people get hung up is our assumption that the Iranians will want to mount these things to missiles the same way that we do now, right? And that the Russians do, the Soviets did. I think it's reasonable to believe that's what the Iranians want. They have invested heavily in their missile force. I think they've demonstrated proficiency with their missile force. But I don't think it's a necessary step for them to declare themselves a nuclear weapons state and to demonstrate that, to be able to mount it onto a missile. That is something they can do thereafter. And what that all basically comes down to is you don't have to have done all the miniaturization work that you have to do to be able to mount something on a missile. The Iranians could do something much more crude. And there was even press reports about this back in January that the Iranians may have been playing with this in order to have a near-term option. All the way is saying, I think it's really hard to make the argument that, we're really far away from Iranian nuclear devices when we still don't know a lot about both their physical capacities as well as some of the science that they've done.
Okay, so you think in all likelihood the program is badly damaged, and I think you said it's probably set back several years.
The big part of the program. The weapons program, I think we have to think we still don't know the answer.
Because that's so much easier to hide, and we don't know what they were doing. So,
Right.
Since we last spoke, have you learned anything else about what the Israelis claimed, which was that, quote, the Iranian nuclear weapons group in Iran had begun to pick up its work on weaponization after the Israeli airstrikes in October? Does that sound like a cover story to you, or have we heard a little bit more that maybe what the Iranians were advancing like they weren't previously?
Everything we've heard continues to be that the Israelis think that this was happening. It's not even clear to me that all the Israelis do. I don't think we've gotten a very clear picture as to how Mossad and IDF look at this as opposed to people more on the political side of thing in Israel. The comments that have been made by U.S. Officials have been mixed. The president said he thinks that they were moving very close. Other people have not confirmed that. And even when Tulsi Gabbard kind of retweeted her testimony trying to clarify it and blaming the dishonest media, she basically said they're weeks to months away from a nuclear weapon. Well, frankly, that was no different than we'd already known, and it doesn't shed any light as to whether or not they were actively working on weaponization. I think, though, it's worth noting as a caveat to all this, it wouldn't surprise me, and I don't think it would surprise many people if after the shock of what happened in October, the destruction of Hezbollah, the destruction of Hamas, that the Iranians had stepped it up a bit. But the problem with nuclear issues in the Middle East, especially over the last 20 odd years, is that the burden of proof is felt more by the people who are doing the accusing. And I think if the Israelis are not in a position to demonstrate that they had a near-term risk here, it's going to, cause political reverberations, as we look forward to when Iran may actually be breaking out. And I think that's a point that we really shouldn't bury here. We're not out of the woods yet with regard to nuclear weaponization, and to some extent, we might have lost a step here because the IAEA does not have access to the materials. They may not have access to the sites, and so our ability to really argue what the Iranians are doing, what they can do, is going to be set back as a result.
Let me ask you this. The IAEA did have access to Iran, but it felt like they only had access to what the Iranians wanted them to see, not everything. So I've heard people say, a real casualty of the bombing is that we won't have the IAEA visibility anymore. But if we were only seeing what the Iranians wanted us to see, should we value the IAEA access as much as people are claiming?
Well, look, I mean, if we didn't have IEA access, we'd have no idea how much 60% they had, and we wouldn't know where it is. That, I mean, to me, that's a huge, bit of value that the IEA was able to give us. Without the IEA there, we wouldn't have a sense of what the performance is of the IR6 centrifuge, or at least not a public, right? So we wouldn't know that it was, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 times stronger, more efficient, more effective than the IR1. Without the IEA's access, we wouldn't have, the information about how many centrifuges they produced in the past to give us a sense of how many they could be producing now and where they were installed. So you can add this up, and I think the picture that we had of Iran's nuclear program was stronger with IEA access, especially the public picture. Without the IEA's access, we would be left with what intelligence services are able to produce. And I've been thinking about this a lot in the last couple hours. Intelligence services do a tremendous job, but even they need checks. And most of the time they check against each other. But then you have a risk of one or two sources providing the same information in one or two services. And I'm not talking about people, I'm talking about eavesdropping and things like that. The IEA and the data it was able to put out was a useful check for intelligence services to say, yep, that makes sense. Consistent with what we saw, this is the amount of material and those. So I think we have lost a lot with the IEA being out. Now, is there more the IEA could have been giving us? Sure. The Iranians denied a lot of access to the IAEA after the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA, and especially after attacks on Iranian nuclear sites in 2021. They pulled back a lot of that access. So there are lots of things that we're missing there, to be sure. But I think we will feel the absence of IAEA information. We'll feel it both in terms of the information they provide, the arguments they help us make, the ability to actually call out the Iranians. Why do you have 9 to 10 bombs worth of 60%? What exactly are you intending to do with that? And don't tell me about nuclear subfuel. I don't believe you. Those are things that we're in a position to do because we have the IAEA there. And without the IAEA there, I think we're going to miss them. We're going to miss them a lot.
There's some negatives. So we're going to get to the ceasefire in a minute, but just clarification. When you say the 2021 attacks, do you mean Israel launching quadcopter attacks at individual labs? I used to see this a lot on Twitter.
Yes, I believe I'm still required to say someone attacked with quadcopters and similar, and I'll leave that there. But yes, there were attacks that were made.
Yeah, I have it. I retweeted it on my Twitter account way back when, and literally no one commented on it, but it seems significant to me. Third centrifuge site, that was in the papers literally the morning of February 13th. And I think I asked you this last time, but what were they vowing to do? Were they vowing to disclose it to the IAEA? Did it already exist? Was it in an underground facility at Esfahan? What do we know about the mystical third centrifuge site?
So what we know, we've gotten a few more pieces of this, and some of this came out of the Iranians, and some of this came out of Director General Grossi, of the IAEA. I think it's safe to say that the Iranians were going to announce that they had intended to have a new enrichment site. The impression I get is that the centrifuges were not installed at said enrichment site, so it would be a new one, but not one that is functional yet. Presumably, it would be constructed with the centrifuges that the Iranians had been producing, but that is a presumption still at this moment. That it would be located at Esfahan. I don't know that anyone has gotten a real bead on where at Esfahan, but I think the Iranian approach has been to put things in tunnels and buried locations as opposed to above ground. So I think it is reasonable to believe it would have been in the tunnel complex as opposed to in one of the above ground sites. I mean, that wouldn't make any sense at all. Consistent with all the other risks. And the Iranians did describe it as, I believe the words they used were invulnerable. So that it makes sense to me that they would have probably put it in the tunnel complex. So yeah, that's I think what we know at this point about that site. Just as a bit of math for everybody, when we've done the numbers before, it basically takes the Iranians a week to install a cascade of IR6 centrifuges to mount them to the pads, balance them, get them stood up, put the rotors in, the casings in, put the pipes up, all the stuff you have to do. About a week. Now that's a week when you're not having bombs dropping on your heads. It's a week when your family isn't being, potentially attacked. So, whether or not they could keep to a week timeline over the last couple of weeks, I think is a little debatable. But I would just say that if the Iranians started the installation process, on that day, they potentially could already have a first cascade of IR-6s up and running. I can't prove that. I'm just saying that as a theoretical possibility.
So let me just run one thing by you. I've been saying to anyone who will listen, this has been a success, but don't get panicked in coming days if there's a New York Times article that says we missed the HEU, or there's a centrifuge crate somewhere, or we think there's another site that we missed, because the Iranians are the masters of denial and deception. They have been for 20 years, and as good as the Israelis and the United States are intel-wise, we can't probably know everything. And we shouldn't freak out because in the end, this substantially degraded their program. Is that fair? Are we going to see something soon that is going to just totally repudiate the efficacy of these strikes?
I mean, we might. Look, I think if we see that Times article that says the Iranians took bulldozers and they dug out Fordo and they dug out Esfahan tunnels, and yeah, the centrifuges were badly damaged by the attack, but the cylinders of gas, the cylinders of UF6, that were at Fordo, they're basically intact, and the cylinders in Esfahan, they weren't damaged at all. So, Iran has 5 to 6, 6 to 7 nuclear weapons worth of 60% someplace. I think that's a cause for concern. I think it's also a cause for concern if the Iranians say, well, that third enrichment site that we were going to tell the world about the day before the attack started, well, it's up and running, and it's now in even deeper tunnels than Esfahan. So, good luck with that. I think those are reasons to have real concern. I think on the positive side, the military campaign has demonstrated that between the United States and Israel, we have the capacity to reach out and touch various aspects of the program. I think the Iranians will be concerned if they try and move that equipment and they try and move that material and they try and even move a nuclear device into position to test, all those sorts of things, that they would be detected and potentially attacked before they could do so. I think we can also say, as much as I'm worried that they might have the ability to produce weapons material now, can't prove that either. So it might be they have one component of the puzzle, but they've lost other components. So I think what we really need to do more than anything is now see what facts we can get out of the Iranian side and to then run it through the logic meter. If the Iranians say Fordo is perfectly up and running, everything's great, not a scratch on it, but no, you can't come in IAEA to prove that's true, I think we can kind of say, yeah, I'm not so sure I believe it, right? By the same token, I think if the Iranians say, we are reconstituting our program right now, frankly, that's been the assumption of the Israeli and U.S. intelligence services since military action was contemplated. I mean, it has always been assumed that if you did not topple the Iranian government would reconstitute a nuclear program if it physically could. And I think they are still physically capable of doing so. The question is really a time and materials.
I mean, I think they're definitely going to restart it, but I think we're more into a situation where the Israelis, just like they hit Hezbollah from time to time, or when anything pops its head up, I wouldn't be a bit surprised to see the Israelis doing this every few months as they see new targets.
I wouldn't either. But, again, this is where, with all the love and respect to my Israeli friends, they are also capable of strategic surprise, right? We saw this on October 7th, and we've seen this in the past as well. No intelligence service is perfect. And that goes back to the uncertainties that have now been created are real. I'll give you another example on IAEA access. Okay, let's say the Iranians even decide to play nice with the IAEA. And they say, we'll let you in. Come in. Yeah, you can see Fordo, all our broken centrifuges. You can see Natanz, all of our broken centrifuges. Oh, what's that? The 400 kilograms? Oh, it was destroyed. And the IAEA will say, well, can you show us the cylinders where those destroyed? And they'll take them to a cylinder that, if for all we know, some Iranian bulldozer ran over 20 minutes ago and, stuck under the rubble. And that 400 kilograms of 60% is buried like the Ark of the Covenant in some warehouse someplace. So, to me, part of the risk that we've got here, and it's a permanent risk now, is the uncertainties about what is left after the attack and what the Iranians can cover up.
As we're writing on each side of the ledger here, that we may have badly damaged the program, the big part of the program for several years is a plus. Losing IAEA access may be a negative. Let me ask you a question here. Here we are in 2025, and we need to see some more bomb damage assessments, but we've seen a lot of destruction. Would you rather the JCPOA still be in effect, or would you rather be in the position we're in right now?
I'd rather the JCPOA, because the JCPOA would have had the Iranians contained and we wouldn't have this HEU problem until 2030. And then in 2031, if we had the problem that we have today. But realistically, just given how much time the Iranians would have been delayed, we're talking actually 2035, we had to launch these military attacks, then 2035 is better than 2025 from that standpoint. I think the big problem that is still a reasonable problem for people to articulate with regard to the JCPOA was what sanctions relief was going to do in terms of Iran's regional activities, what Iran's missile program could look like in 2035 as opposed to 2025. So there are definitely, I think, material advantages in terms of what Iran's capabilities weren't in being able to defend themselves against the attacks that were launched. And I think those are real. And I think that, if I'm sitting in Israel and I'm thinking, would I rather face an Iranian missile program of 2035 as opposed to 2025? I think I know what the answer is. But as I sit back here and I'm trying to think about the status of the nuclear program itself, we would have more time on the clock before we're at this moment with the uncertainties we have at this moment than we do right now.
But you can understand why the Israelis went for it.
Sure. No, look, Again, I can understand why the Israelis went for it. Back in January, I wrote an article on Foreign Affairs that some people didn't like very much, especially on the JCPOA side of things, in which I said, military force may be a real thing we have to do, including this year. And I believe in that argument. I believe in that argument now, too, because the Iranian nuclear program had made significant advances, including the production of HEU and was potentially on the precipice of a bomb. And all the downsides of what happens if the Iranians are going to march to breakout were absolutely present. And those have been, to some extent, dealt with now. This is where a real fundamental question is, but have they been dealt with enough? And my argument in that piece, and I would say it to the Israelis now, if you're going to do this, you really have to do it. And the uncertainties that we have around material and the amount of time that the Iranians had at Fordo, the amount of time they had at Esfahan, that's what gives me pause. The fact that the Israelis decided they had to act on the basis of the information they have, I can understand that. But then it's a question of, how they did it and what are the uncertainties that they left.
Okay, so this brings me to the ceasefire. And I think you just hit on it. Have they been dealt with enough? Have the Israelis been able to deal with, who knows? We're not in the National Security Council of Israel looking at the target lists, but I think I was under the impression from the Israeli press that this was going to go on for another week. And I kind of thought there were more military and nuclear sites they needed to hit. But honestly, by the end of this week, I thought we would be seeing what I call regime change targeting. I thought we would see, and I've seen it on Twitter, but I can't confirm it, that they've hit all the strongholds of the besiege, or that they were going to hit oil and gas facilities, not Karg Island, but more things that would affect the everyday consumer with Iran, to, in other words, exacerbate the economic misery that they feel and maybe condition them to go out in the streets and begin to protest. So I have to admit, I was a little surprised that we had a ceasefire yesterday. Maybe the president was just able to bludgeon Netanyahu into agreeing to it, and he certainly had a lot of he was carrying a big stick after intervening on Fordow. But what's your read of all of this? Did this seem like an abrupt ceasefire to you?
Yes. Yeah. And not just, it seemed like an abrupt ceasefire, both in terms of the timing, it was also the way it was announced, and the fact that the Iranians and the Israelis, neither of them have said that there's an agreed ceasefire. Neither of them have said, that they've written down what the terms are. I don't think there are any terms. And the fact that it took many hours to actually roll out, with the timeline being pretty inconsistent. Arakchi, yesterday, the foreign minister of Iran, he was talking about a 4:00 Tehran time, deadline for strikes to stop. Well, that was 2 hours, different than what the president had said. So I think the ceasefire itself clearly came together very quickly. I think it was pretty ambiguous. I think the terms were pretty ambiguous. They're ambiguous today. And I think based on how the Israelis reacted, both in terms right up to the moment of and even after the Iranian missiles came in after the ceasefire was supposed to take hold, I think they're demonstrating that they're being restrained here, and that might not have been their preference to do this when they did. I know the prime minister has said that the war aims have been achieved, at least and exceeded in some places. That may be true, but you really couldn't have predicted that, I don't think, around 2:00 yesterday afternoon, based on what was going on.
I wonder, and I can't wait to hear the inside stories of how all of this went down. I mean, the news, of course, this morning is about whether or not they are adhering to the ceasefire. So we're just going to have to see how this goes. So let's talk, before we get to maximum pressure and whether that is still U.S. policy and the rest. We talked about this a little bit last week, but let's attack again some of the energy infrastructure. When you look at what's been struck so far, we've seen some economic targets hit. Do you think the Israelis were just testing the waters to see whether any Iranians would go to the streets? I can't see any evidence of it online, but what do you think they were up to when they hit some economic targets, but not all?
Well, so I think it's one of two things, which unfortunately point in kind of opposite directions. One was that it was the start of a path that they intended to embark on, the Israelis, to both increase domestic pressure on the government by attacking primarily domestic-facing energy infrastructure, but also as a signal that we can ratchet up and we're prepared to touch those sorts of spaces. And they were waved off by the U.S., in particular, that was concerned about global economic impact if that led the Iranians to target the Straits of Hormuz and other economic targets. I mean, we understand that over the course of this entire conflict, there was messaging going back and forth between the Iranians and the United States, clearly going with Qatar and the United States. And it wouldn't surprise me if the Iranians, said to the U.S. via any number of intermediaries, hey, if the Israelis keep attacking these targets, we're absolutely prepared to go after our energy infrastructure. And we saw some movement of ships in around Bandar Abbas. Could have been they were moving themselves out of harm's way. Could have been they were moving in a position. Don't really know the answer to that at this point. So that's path one. Path two is that when the Iranians were able to hit the Haifa refinery, there was almost an implicit agreement. If we don't hit yours, you won't hit ours. And that's where the shift went away from energy infrastructure at that point. There was kind of a tit for tat sort of response there. And then at that point, a lot of the attacks on the energy infrastructure seemed to have abated, although there were still targets on electricity in Tehran and electricity in Israel as well. So, I think ultimately where I come back to is probably more the former than the latter, that there was some messaging going back and forth that right now this is contained to, military targets and to nuclear targets, missile targets, and similar. Let's keep it in that space. I think one thing that we all learned, and I'm perfectly happy to put my hand up to this too, I would not have expected in the context of the Fordo strikes, the Iranians communicating to the Qataris exactly when they were going to try and hit Al Udeid, and the U.S. being able to get out of harm's way and basically solve that problem and make it a performative strike. Wouldn't have guessed that, before this conflict started, that there would be this level of choreography, but there has been. And I think that gives me, in my own head, a reason to kind of recalibrate what my expectations are of Iranian actions and how they proceed through their decision-making process as well.
So just to state the obvious, the fact that they called the Qataris and said, we're going to send these missiles at this time, really just communicated that they had no stomach for targeting and possibly killing any U.S. soldiers, because it would have been all hell breaking loose from us.
Could be. I mean, I think that's a reasonable, way to look at it. The other way it could be is the Iranians wanted this thing to end, and that they thought the cycle of escalation would go against them. Could be that they were worried about, upsetting the Gulf Arab states, and then resulting in that downward spiral too. I think the most reasonable conclusion is that they just decided that the juice wasn't worth the squeeze at this particular moment, that they demonstrated they can hit U.S. bases. I mean, the matter is they did fire on a U.S. base in a Arab country, and a friendly one at that. And that may have signaling effect for the Iranians. I will say, as a former American official, this makes me feel a little bit more comfortable if we were to ever go up the escalation ladder again, that the Iranians are worried about what would happen. But that can be a lesson that you overlearn too.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Richard Nephew.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
I think if you asked the Trump administration, well, you missed some crates, you missed some HEU, and there's a site that pops up, they'd say, well, you know what? This is going to be now subject to negotiations. We've strengthened the president's hand. He's proven he can use force, and now he's a more fierce negotiator. I don't know whether I believe that we're going to be able to have meaningful negotiations with the Iranians anytime soon, which leads me to the conclusion that, and then we should definitely discuss what the president just tweeted out about China and oil. It doesn't feel like we're in negotiation mode or still in maximum pressure sanctions mode. Comment on where you think we are.
Yeah, I'll put my hand up to being kind of confused too. I mean, here's what I will say. I had thought that a ceasefire would come along with terms, but we haven't seen any terms. Now, that might be because there are terms, they just simply haven't made public. It could be that there just aren't any terms. The term was stop. And that term has now been met, and now the process will either start again or not. And those are all things that we don't know the answer to, at this point. I'll say, on whether or not this strengthens the hand, it might. I mean, look, as I try and look back at my history here, I think it's pretty apparent to me, I think this is historically consistent with other folks' findings, that Muammar Gaddafi, part of the reason why he negotiated with the Bush administration and with the Blair government was because of the invasion of Iraq, and he gave up his nuclear and missile and other programs as a result of all that. I think it's conceivable that the Iranians could look around at the craters that exist in Natanz and other places and say, oh, it's not worth doing this again. And so we're prepared to give away enrichment and similar, at least, declared enrichment. And we'll always have that asterisk, next to that. I think it's also entirely plausible to me that they say, well, you got what you wanted, so clearly we don't need to have restrictions at Natanz anymore, so that's not a problem anymore. And so we'll take that sanctions relief now, and off we go, right? I mean, how the negotiation process, begins and the terms of that, I think is pretty important. And, I've written elsewhere about, some of the ceasefire terms that should have been, things like, a controlled disposition of equipment, a controlled disposition of material, interviews with Iranian, scientists, redirection programs like we did with Libya and we did with the former Soviet Union. I mean, those sorts of things. If we're just going to kind of leave this as is, then it's a question of whether or not negotiators are going to sit back indirectly again and work something out, or whether or not we're just going to pause in the conflict. Frankly, we don't have enough information at this point to really be sure we know what we're talking about. I will say, and you got to this with the tweet. This tweet the president sent out a few moments ago, basically saying, Iran can keep selling its oil to China, and I hope that China will buy U.S. oil. And, thanks for your attention to this matter. May have been one of the more shocking things I've read. It does certainly imply that, max pressure might be in place, but except for China. Maybe this is the idea that sanctions will remain unchanged, but that sanctions evasion from China, purchasing from Iran will be allowed to happen. I honestly don't know, but it does not imply to me that the U.S. thinks that there is any problem anymore with Iranian economic activity, at least with the Chinese, and that's a change.
To hear you talk about the lack of terms in this ceasefire agreement is a good one. You're right. It feels like Israel may not want to get into any agreement with the Iranians because they want to be able to bomb them again later. But it is kind of
Yeah.
curious, though. It feels like we would have at least made a few asks of the Iranians
You think?
before agreeing. Like when we have them, we have our hand at their throat. Now's the time to ask.
I mean, this is where I'll say again. I kind of expected the announcement of a ceasefire to then come out with a short term sheet. I mean, frankly, even if the terms were something like we agree to meet in Oman in 3 days' notice or something like that, something. But honestly, we have none of that now. Now, again, I should say maybe that'll come out today. We'll see. I do think that the incident today with the president coming out very, very hot on the Israelis in particular. I mean, he was grumpy with the Iranians, but I think his rhetoric with the Israelis was incredibly sharp, is actually pretty important here. And let me draw that out a little bit more. So over the next week, 2 weeks, the Iranians are going to start cleanup activities at Fordo, Esfahan, Natanz, all these other different nuclear sites. The Israelis are going to be watching this very carefully. If we see the Iranians take bulldozers to the entrances of Fordo and the Esfahan tunnels, and then we see trucks show up, what are we or the Israelis going to do? Now, I think all other things being equal, just as we've seen in Lebanon and in Syria and in Gaza, I would have expected that the Iranians would be on standby if they thought something important was coming out of the tunnels to come and attack. Whether or not that's a good idea or a bad idea, that is my default expectation. But I think the president made very clear that a ceasefire is incredibly important to him and that he would be very upset with the Israelis if they did that. What is the term sheet for that? What is the discussion between the United States and Israel on the reconstitution effort? Is there a certain level of reconstitution that will break the ceasefire itself? Have the Iranians accepted that? Clearly they haven't. So that question alone could kill the ceasefire in the next 48 hours, let alone any of these other things that are out there. And what the president will do and how he'll react to the Israelis and to the Iranians, that is unknown at this point.
I really believe that if that happens, the Israelis would just go in again. I mean, they're not messing around anymore. That they absolutely aren't going to just say, I think they just call him and say, look, this is still existential to us and we have a new target and we've got to go and do it.
They might, and I'm not saying you're wrong, but I am going to say the president is also tweeting away and the administration saying the nuclear program is done. It's kaput. I think the other tweet that the president issued today was Iran will never rebuild its nuclear program. So is that because he's saying they agreed not to? Is that saying because I won't let them? Is that because he's saying the Israelis won't let them? Which of those things? And if the ceasefire falls apart because of a dumpster, right, being stationed outside Fordo, is that something he's going to want to do when he thinks that he's achieved this very significant event here? And this all goes back to the nature of the U.S.-Israeli relationship under the president and under Netanyahu. It's had its bumps. I think right now we're in a reasonably positive spot, I would imagine. But even this morning we have indications of not. Will Netanyahu want to upset Donald Trump and undermine him in this moment? Maybe. But I think it comes with more decisions and more questions than it might have 6 weeks ago.
So this is the drawback of the United States saying we're not nation building right now. We're one and done. It's absolutely the case that you can just bomb and end a war, because what it might be saying to the Iranians is, we're not coming back. And it looks maybe like they're wondering maybe the president will ride herd over Netanyahu and not let him go back in. So
Absolutely.
That's a real problem here. I think the Iranians would do it. Can you help me before we did you see the tweets 2 nights ago that there were trucks, I think it was Saturday day, lined up outside of Fordow? Now, to me, they look like dump trucks. To me, it looked like they were just putting dirt around the entrances so that if you had an Israeli commando raid, it would have been a hell of a hard time even getting to the door to put on explosives. But a lot of people are saying, including some prominent people in the arms control community, that it could have been them spiriting away the HEU. Have you gotten any clarity on this? Did you see anything in particular as you saw all of this imagery?
No, I mean, so when I originally saw the imagery, I had the same questions. Subsequently, reading things, talking to folks, the impression I've gotten is that they were dump trucks that were dumping dirt, and that they then moved off site and stayed there. They didn't race away to some other site. It's worth noting, though, that that was one satellite image taken at one particular moment in time. What was happening when the satellites weren't overhead? What was happening, when the Iranians, hadn't yet been attacked, on day 3 as opposed to day 10. Those are the things we don't know about. The Iranians have been maintaining that they moved everything out. They very well may have moved out some things. Now, I don't think anyone believes that they moved out, 3,000 centrifuges. I don't frankly think they could have. They didn't have time for that kind of thing. But, the cylinders that we're talking about could be loaded in the back of a couple of pickup trucks. And, you could potentially do that, while you also have the dump trucks pulling up with a bunch of dirt. This is where, to me, the kind of the snapshots that you get from overhead imagery, they give you something. It may be misleading either direction, because if they're dump trucks, we say, oh, they didn't move anything away, but we missed the truck that was there 3 hours before. We don't know, at least in the public space, at this point. It may be that U.S. intelligence, I hope U.S. intelligence, I hope Israeli intelligence knows where that material is. Certainly that's what Senator Mullen was saying a short while ago. But, even then, that's only Fordow, right? It wasn't all of Iran's nuclear material located at Fordow. Iran also had nuclear material at Esfahan. They had nuclear material in Natanz. Where all that stuff is at this point, it may not be, the full 9 to 10 bombs worth of material, but there still could be a substantial and dangerous amount of material out there in space.
Do you know why we didn't use a bunker buster bomb on Esfahan? Did that have anything to do with, well, you know what, the HEU is there and we're worried about radioactivity, or what would, I don't want to lead the witness, but I was surprised. Why didn't we?
So I am not a munitions expert, so I will just say what I had understood in the past. If you actually look at the depth of the tunnels at Esfahan, they are double as deep as Fordow. And Fordow, there were questions about how far the MOP would be able to go. And I would just note, we used a large number of MOPs to take out Fordow, if in fact that was successful. If we used over half of our supply of MOPs just on Fordow, it may have been the conclusion that Fordow was a more likely success and a more important target than what would have been at the tunnels of Esfahan, especially if there were questions about how we could reach it.
So, okay, so that's really interesting. The tunnel, I don't know that I'd quite heard it like that. The tunnels were even deeper than Fordow, so don't even bother to use a bunker buster at Esfahan.
Well, I mean, so, and again, here I'll hat tip the folks at the good ISIS, David Albright's group. They did some imagery analysis of this. I think it was probably about 10 years or so ago. It's available online on their website. But basically, they did some measurements there, and their assessment of the tunnels was that they were about double what Fordow was. Now, again, there might be some bits that are above, some bits that aren't, but that was the assessment that they used, and it's the most that I've seen the unclassed environment to give a picture of what the tunnel complex probably looks like.
Let me ask you one more thing here. I want to ask you about radioactivity in a second, but I don't have it in front of me, but I thought I saw that either at Esfahan, maybe it was even Natanz, that there was a new centrifuge hall being built, or at least some cavernous gymnasium type thing, but that it wasn't damaged. But it didn't. Is that right? And why in the world, even if it's empty, why wouldn't you just go ahead and knock it out?
So there was another tunnel set that was being dug. Again, if you have in your mind the picture of Natanz with that L and the two cascade halls there, basically below that, there's a tunnel complex being built to the Zagros Mountains. And my understanding, based on other people's work that they've done of imagery analysis, is that while the Iranians had been digging there, they had not dug it out completely. And so it may be that the view was it's a hole. It isn't anything else yet. And so it's more like a mine shaft than anything that's more sensitive. But again, this is one of those things that's an ambiguity. Part of not to nerd out here too much, but part of what the Iranians have done over the last few years too, once they withdrew from the NPT, or from the JCPOA rather, is they are no longer providing declarations of new nuclear sites when they decide to build them. It's one of the rules that they signed up to both originally back in the early 2000s and then into the JCPOA. They're not doing that anymore. Now they're back to the old interpretation, which is right before nuclear material is introduced. So what that potentially means is that the Iranians could have been digging it out with the intention of it being a new enrichment facility, but they haven't gotten to the level yet of declaring it to the IAEA the way they were about to declare this new place, a week and a half ago.
Radioactivity. Some have suggested early on in the conflict, but I think David Albright and others have addressed this, and you did as much as well. If we were to have bombed the cylinders of 60% HEU, would it have created a significant radioactivity event such that we would have avoided hitting it in the first place?
I don't think so. So very different than hitting a reactor. If you hit a reactor that's operating, you all the stuff that reactors produce, plutonium and cesium and all these other hot actinides that are produced out of reactor operations, those potentially spread. And so that's where if you ever looked at a radioactive plume analysis, you can look these up online. Basically, you should see that where the winds go, you have nuclear material flowing, just like we did with Chernobyl, right? People probably remember Chernobyl. Chernobyl, exploded, and there was a plume that then extended over first Eastern Europe, and then eventually went around the world. If you were to attack HEU or any other kind of enriched uranium, there is a contamination issue there, but it's a different form of radiation, and as a result of all that, there is a threat, but it is much more localized. It's about ingestion, inhalation that goes away with more distance and time. And so I don't think that would have stopped us from attacking that material if we had laying out in the open and had an opportunity to do so. Another colleague pointed out to me that there is a criticality issue there. So it is possible that if you were to attack a large set of cylinders with 60% and detonate them, the material potentially could come together, and that would create a accidental nuclear reaction, so a criticality incident. That seems pretty unlikely to me. I guess it's a theoretical possibility that one should think about. But I think, to me, it all gets back to, as we saw with the attacks in Natanz and Fordo, the U.S., the Israelis were not afraid about attacking operating enrichment plants because the risk of environmental contamination and criticality incidents in the similar was relatively low. Not like a reactor. And it's worth noting, the Israelis did not attack an operating reactor, either at the Tehran Nuclear Research Center or at Bushehr.
I thought they did hit some reactor. I thought I heard that.
The Iraq reactor, ARAK reactor, that one was not
operational. Got it.
Right.
Okay,
right.
Two more questions. First, just could you forecast for a second here? Yesterday I was saying that what I was going to watch the most this week was whether the Israelis started to hit more regime change targets, economic, etc. But now that seems unlikely. What do you foresee happening in the next few days? Put your forecasting hat on.
It's rough, but I'll give it a shot. So I think two or three things I think are reasonable. One, I think you're going to continue to see the president really try and protect this deal. So things like the sanctions relief concept with China, things like really putting pressure on the Iranians and the Israelis not to restart. I think he sees the ceasefire as an important part of his legacy, just as much as the Fordo attack was itself. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure being put on the Israelis not to restart attacks, the Iranians not to restart attacks. That doesn't mean they're not going to be tested. I still think the possibility of terrorist attacks emanating out of Iran, out of the Israelis or unknown forces perhaps inside of Iran, attacking a person or a place, potentially a regime leader or something similar. I think that's still there, but I think the president's going to put a lot of pressure on people not to do that. I think that there is going to be the announcement of some new negotiating process, probably involving the Omanis, maybe involving the Qataris since they were just involved. But I don't think it's going to achieve anything approaching a near-term deal. I think that is incredibly unlikely to my mind at this point. At best, we might have greater clarification of ceasefire terms. That I frankly really hope we find out. Tell me what the nuclear terms are. Tell me if there is sanctions relief. Tell me what the military terms are. And then I think the third big thing is we're going to see the Iranians start to dig out and reconstitute. I think that if we don't see a bulldozer showing up at Esfahan or Natanz sometime soon, or at Fordo, I would be really surprised. And I think that's going to be one of these big tests for this ceasefire process is, what are we actually doing about the reconstitution effort that the Iranians almost certainly are going to be beginning very soon? One asterisk additional prediction, not really relevant to the nuclear discussion we've been having, and the big strategic one is internal repression inside of Iran. A lot of Iran watchers are really worried that the Iranian government is going to take out a lot of its frustration on the people of Iran. There may be less desire to do that out of fear of encouraging the regime collapse approach that the Israelis, I think, were on. But I do think you should expect to hear about arrests of dissidents, arrests of any protesters, pretty harsh response if there are any. Certainly, there's going to be a lot more spies, either real or imagined, arrested in Iran. So I think the repressive apparatus is also going to kick into motion.
Okay, the big question, you began to address it there, but the big question for you is, will the Iranians begin to reconstitute a nuclear program? And it sounds like you're a yes. I'm a yes, too.
Yes.
It's the nature of the regime. Am I right? It would be out of character for them to just say, especially after this humiliating 12 days, to just say, you know what, this is not worth it.
I cannot conceive of that. Now, again, I think we all do acknowledge some amount of bias here, right? Because I'm biased by the assumption that the Iranians have wanted to have this option, will want to have this option, that they see their strategic defense having completely been shattered, and they'll want to rebuild that in the cheapest and easiest way. And nuclear weapons are probably an easier and cheaper way than reconstituting the proxies and the broad missile forces that are conventional in nature and those sort of things. So I'll acknowledge that as a bias, but I think that the Iranians, both for a national prestige standpoint and frankly from a strategic self-defense standpoint, are going to say, if we don't have nuclear weapons, we are just going to be as at risk as Muammar Gaddafi was. We'd rather be Kim Jong-un. And that the U.S. will not, challenge us if we have nuclear weapons. The Israelis will not challenge us. Now, that may all be false. Those notions about that strategic defense may not be true. But I do think that the Iranians are much more motivated to reconstitute their program today than they probably were a couple of weeks ago.
So many people are correctly talking about the implications of October 7th, and look what it eventually wrought. But maybe we ought to look at this is almost like October 7th for the Iranian regime. I mean, they're not going to take this lying down. This is going to go on for years. They're going to have a comeback program. I don't see them trying to rejoin the international community here. So we're just going to, I think we did a lot of good here, but this is not over.
No. And I think this is where, there were some heady predictions a couple of minutes into the conflict now what, 12 days ago, 13 days ago, that the Iranian regime is about to collapse. They're about to go, this is our opportunity. Everything will be fine after this. Even if that were true, and I'm not sure it ever was true, even if it were true, the fact that the conflict ended and the Iranian government is still fully in charge, I don't see any reason to believe that this is over now. I think that this is going to be a much longer story, and there's going to be some consequences as a result of this. And this is part of the reason why, to some extent, what comes next, ceasefire negotiations, if there is a deal, all that, it is just as important as what may have been accomplished with the military strikes, because that speaks to the longevity of what may have been achieved.
Richard, thanks again. That was terrific. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to doing, maybe we'll do another one next week. Thanks for doing this.
Always a pleasure. Good talking to you.
That was Richard Nephew. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.